We think that Charlie Kirk just got shot in the neck. Ay, ooh, ah.
I will not ever feel bad when bad people get what the f they deserve.
We got Charlie in the neck. We got Charlie in the neck.
What does it say about a culture that celebrates murder? What are the consequences and implications for such a culture? And is it possible for us to avoid the perpetuation of violence that is very clearly just around the corner? I've spent a lot of time thinking about the murder of Brian Thompson, the UnitedHealthcare CEO that was gunned down last year, especially since the shooting of Charlie Kirk just last week. In particular, I've thought about the public response to these two events, the indifference, mockery, and even outright celebration with which these deaths were met. No matter what you think of these two men, their killings are clearly linked in terms of what they represent to the cultural zeitgeist. And in this video, I wanted to spend some time exploring some of the similarities and differences between them. A couple of disclaimers at the outset. First, I want to make it clear that I do not condone either of these killings or any similar events. And while I will be drawing comparisons between the two of them, I don't want anything I say to be misconstrued as support or advocacy or anything even approaching that. To start, what do these two killings have in common? Both Brian Thompson and Charlie Kirk were killed in public on camera and were shot with bullets engraved with overt ideological messages. Both assassinations were political in nature, and some of you might say that Brian Thompson's death wasn't political, but I disagree. I think that in late-stage crony capitalism, which we are currently enjoying, economics and politics are inextricably tied. UnitedHealthcare's unethical claim denial policies that were widely cited as the motivation behind the killing of Brian Thompson wouldn't be possible without a captured, ineffective government regulatory body that no longer serves the interests of the American people. And finally, both killings had a fairly large public outcry of approval, derision, mockery, or even outright celebration. Because, at least according to their detractors, both of these men represented monopolistic systems of power, which many people feel helpless to fight against through legitimate nonviolent means. And this is the part that I want to focus on. From the public's perspective, Brian Thompson, as CEO of UnitedHealthcare, participated in the exploitative physical, financial, and psychological harm of hundreds of thousands of people, with many suffering from permanent injury or even death as a result. He wasn't solely responsible, of course, but as CEO of the largest and most profitable healthcare insurance provider, he was uniquely positioned to influence company policy and chose to actively make things worse. During his tenure, UHC increased its profitability to the tune of billions of dollars. And in the simplest terms, healthcare insurance companies are more profitable when they deny healthcare coverage to people who have paid for it. And for his part in this process, he was compensated with a salary of $10.2 million per year, which, as a point of comparison that I think is relevant, was almost equal to Charlie Kirk's entire net worth. Upon the killing of Brian Thompson, there was an almost immediate flood of people on social media openly celebrating and mocking his death. And not only that, but Luigi Mangione, the man who allegedly pulled the trigger, was turned into a folk hero and a literal sex icon overnight. Yes, there were some people who spoke out against this killing and pointed out that it was inhumane to dance on the grave of a husband and a father, but I don't remember anyone losing their job or suffering any kind of meaningful negative social impact for participating in this public revelry. Now, I want you to consider, as I did at the time and still do today, what message did this overtly positive response send out to the American public? In my mind, the message was clearly that killing a corporate CEO will turn you into a public hero. And this is important because there are a lot of disaffected young men in this country who have realized or are coming to the realization that they will never be able to escape from debt slavery, or afford a house, or raise a family, or even come close to enjoying the living standards that their parents enjoyed, and certainly not their grandparents. I think Tyler Durden said it best.
We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off.
And what does history tell us happens when you have millions of disaffected, desperate, and angry young men with no hope for the future and easy access to firearms? I'm not a huge history buff, but I don't know if there even is a precedent for that combination of factors at this kind of scale. Frankly, I am shocked that we haven't seen a lot more copycat killings already. I would imagine that for many of these young men, Probably one of the only things that ever held them back from taking out their frustrations on some random CEO was the fear that they would be shamed and hated by society. Which brings us to Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, the co-founder of Turning Point USA, was a very well-known conservative speaker and a fairly controversial figure. And I say fairly controversial because anyone who is actually familiar with his political ideology would know that he was actually a pretty average, milquetoast, run-of-the-mill establishment Republican. Someone who would have been considered completely ordinary and mainstream just a decade or two ago. For those of you on the left, take my word when I say that one of Charlie's biggest criticisms from the perspective of the right is that he was not nearly extreme enough in his views. Let that sink in for a minute. From the perspective of the left, I think that Charlie's two greatest sins were that he was very closely aligned with the Trump administration, and at least up until the last few months of his life, he was an unwavering supporter of the State of Israel and an apologist for the ongoing military campaign in Gaza. These two things in particular, I think, painted a target on his back, if you'll forgive the phrasing. In the same way that Brian Thompson was a very obvious and prominent representative of the healthcare insurance industry, Charlie Kirk was an unapologetic ambassador for the Trump administration and the pro-Israel lobby. So if you perceive these two entities as fundamental threats to human life and well-being, as many people obviously do, it's not difficult to see why so many people would have responded to the death of Charlie Kirk in the same way as Brian Thompson. Even for people who are utterly unfamiliar with his actual political outlook, this guilt by association was enough. Now, it's hard these days to get a clear idea of how many of the people you see online espousing a particular view are real people, and how many of those posts you see are just bots or trolls or state actors or what have you. But what is undeniable is that a lot of people are losing their jobs right now. Like, a lot. I've been trying to keep on top of it, and I've lost count at this point. We're talking nurses, doctors, professors, lawyers, tech professionals. A bunch of Delta Airline employees got fired at the same time, a Washington Post columnist, a Sony game developer, a Missouri state deputy. Hell, even a member of the Secret Service was put on unpaid leave. Now, what can we extrapolate from this? Well, these companies and universities and hospitals and government entities would not be firing these people unless the backlash were incredibly strong, unless they were getting absolutely bombarded with negative feedback. Because again, people said really heinous stuff about Brian Thompson, and I don't remember anyone getting fired over that. I mean, maybe some people got fired, but not to this extent. So if the public was overwhelmingly in favor or at least indifferent to the killing of Brian Thompson, the public is clearly overwhelmingly opposed to the killing of Charlie Kirk. The clear consensus is that this assassination was reprehensible, even though the other one was praiseworthy. And I can imagine that this drastic difference in public sentiment was surprising to a lot of these people who are losing their jobs. Hell, I find it at least a little bit surprising myself. But why the difference? Well, let's talk about some of the possible answers to that question. For one thing, I think the nature of the videos themselves is drastically different. For the Brian Thompson shooting, we have one grainy CCTV video. It's not at a great angle, and the lighting conditions were poor, and it really doesn't show anything that graphic. For the Charlie Kirk shooting, there were dozens of people filming in high definition and broad daylight from multiple angles, and it was incredibly graphic. If you still haven't seen it at this point, I don't know that I would recommend it. Honestly, it's pretty disturbing. Also, Charlie Kirk was shot in front of his family. I think that if Brian Thompson had been walking down that street hand in hand with his wife and children, people probably would have felt a lot differently about it. Another important factor was the respective public image of these two individuals. I had never heard of Brian Thompson before he was killed, so I had no personal connection to him as a human being. I'm sure the same is true for many of you. But Charlie Kirk was well known by literally millions of people. His podcast was among the top ranked in the country, especially for conservative media, and his organization Turning Point USA has broad national reach, with official chapters in thousands of colleges and high schools across the country. And the thing that Charlie was most well known for, the thing that he died doing, was sitting down in public places and engaging in dialogue and debate with anyone who wanted to talk to him. The sheer volume of video that exists of this man engaging with people about politics is staggering, as people who had never heard of him are now finding out. For the third and arguably the most significant difference between these two assassinations, we have to ask ourselves the question: what nonviolent alternatives existed. In regards to Brian Thompson and UnitedHealthcare, let's say hypothetically that you or someone close to you were denied coverage for vital health care, and it caused immense permanent life-altering suffering, or that you were denied healthcare coverage and it caused you to go massively into debt and bankrupted your family, and maybe caused you to lose your home or your ability to care for your children. This could be considered by some to be a form of bureaucratic violence committed against you and your family, resulting in physical, psychological, and financial harm. And most importantly, there is no recourse to deal with this kind of systemic exploitation. You cannot appeal to some higher authority because the regulatory bodies which should be protecting your interests by keeping this kind of exploitative healthcare in check and making sure you get what you pay for are they themselves bought and paid for by the private healthcare industry. So in this situation, you and your family have had violence visited upon you, and the normal, legal, legitimate means of defending yourself are not available to you. So what would the alternative be? Again, I'm not advocating for violence, and I'm certainly not saying that this killing was in any way an effective solution to the problem. They just replaced him with somebody else and life goes on. I'm just saying that this kind of violence was probably inevitable based on the socioeconomic circumstances and the public sentiment in this country. And I'm surprised that it didn't happen sooner and that it hasn't happened again since. This is why I think the public response to the killing of Brian Thompson was the way that it was. It's not just that people feel powerless at the hands of an evil, exploitative, monopolistic healthcare industry. It's because they lack any legitimate, legal, non-violent means of addressing these grievances. Now, the obvious comparison to make in relation to Brian Thompson and UnitedHealthcare would be between Charlie Kirk and the Trump administration. As I'm sure many would say, myself included, the federal government is also an evil, exploitative, monopolistic power structure, just of a different flavor. And Charlie Kirk was a willing and enthusiastic representative of and ambassador for at least the current iteration of that power structure. So you would think that his killing would be met with praise by anyone who has felt personally wronged or harmed by the federal government. But this isn't the case. And again, we must consider the question, what nonviolent alternatives existed? Charlie Kirk, I think, personified a principle of Western democracy that few others could or even attempt to anymore. The perhaps naive and outdated ideal that we, as free members of a free society, should be able to sit down across from one another and hash out our political differences through open, good faith dialogue. That the best way to sharpen and validate your own beliefs is to have them challenged aggressively and to be ready to defend them in the public forum. And that this method of truth-seeking and conflict resolution is not only preferable, but absolutely necessary to prevent the decay of Western society and a devolution into tribalistic violence. Now, for what it's worth, I agree with Charlie on this in principle. However, this does not address the greater issue of the complete divorce between public opinion and federal policy. It doesn't matter that the majority of Americans disapprove of, say, Israel's ethnic cleansing in Gaza, or disapproved of bombing Iran, or generally disapprove of interventionist U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't matter that the vast majority of Americans would prefer to federally decriminalize marijuana, which is still considered a Class 1 controlled substance with no accepted medical use. It doesn't matter that there are overwhelming majority opinions on things like paid family leave, or death penalty restrictions, or dozens of other state and federal policies which are not reflective of the public sentiment, because in those instances the will of the people run contrary to corporate interest. And at this point in the game, corporate interest is the only thing that really matters. So, Charlie Kirk, what exactly is the point of sitting down and hashing out our political differences if even in areas where we do achieve a majority consensus, it isn't reflected on a policy level? And is it not hypocritical of you, Charlie Kirk, to apologize for and defend the Trump administration, this current iteration of that hegemonic power structure, even as they fail again and again and again to reflect and manifest the desires of the American majority? Yes, it is hypocritical. And I think that this was one of Charlie's greatest blind spots. But according to the overwhelming majority of Americans, he did not deserve to die for that blind spot. I think that the biggest thing to take away from the killing of Charlie Kirk and the public response to it is that there are still a lot of people in this country who want to believe in the ideals that Charlie Kirk was such an archetypal representation of. People want to believe that free speech and good faith debate and the open exchange of ideas are still relevant and important, not just in this country, but in principle. And for those people, his killing and the celebration of it both serve as a wake-up call for how far we have fallen from that ideal and how little trust we have in our institutions and one another to be able to cooperate in our mutual self-interest. I'll admit, I wasn't really that familiar with Charlie Kirk. I knew that he was a Trump apologist and a Zionist, and those two things were enough for me to basically dismiss him from my sense-making apparatus and not pay him much mind. But over the last week, I've seen dozens and dozens of clips of him espousing his beliefs, and I think that I regret not paying more attention to him while he was still alive. I'm pretty confident that if I'd had the opportunity to sit down with him, he would have engaged with me in good faith, and it would have been a productive conversation. I might have even changed his mind about a few things, and maybe he would have changed my mind about a few things too. But either way, I think he would have been kind and respectful to me, as he was with basically everyone he ever encountered from what I can tell. So, what should we expect moving forward? Well, I think more political violence is unfortunately inevitable, because although this assassination was clearly not as popular as the last one, the underlying socioeconomic conditions and the disconnect between public opinion and government policy, and the hopeless desperation that accompany both of those things still remain. I think that if the next assassination is at all influenced by public sentiment, it will probably be someone far wealthier and more powerful than Charlie Kirk, another CEO or an actual politician. Although these are exactly the kinds of people who can afford private security, so I guess we'll see how that plays out. And just as I said in my previous video, I expect that the Trump administration will use this event as justification to expand the scope of domestic military law enforcement and digital surveillance. We've already heard talk of hate speech legislation from Pam Bondi. Seems like people on the right are pushing back on this pretty hard, but it's coming. I'm sure of it. It takes a special kind of evil to use the death of a free speech absolutist like Charlie Kirk as justification to crack down on free speech. Ultimately, and generally, I think things are going to get worse before they get better. But I actually have more hope for the future, having seen the public response to the killing of Charlie Kirk. I hope that his wife and children are able to find peace, and that the restraint currently exhibited by the right wing in not retaliating with violence against the left continues. I would implore all of you, right and left, to remember your fellow countrymen are as desperate as you are. The real enemy are the people in power who have created these desperate times and conditions.